Welcome to Whitetail Rendezvous Podcast, hosted by Bruce Hutchin, in episode number 158.
Welcome to Whitetail Rendezvous Podcast, where it is all about whitetail deer hunting tips, techniques, and the stories so you can become a more successful whitetail deer hunter. And now your host, Bruce Hutchin.
Jay Scott, Big Buck Registry. Do you love deer hunting stories? Then you've come to the right place. This is an outdoor podcast for deer hunters and meat hunters who love to tell big buck stories and to listen to deer hunting tales from the big woods of the East, the Midwest, and the South. This is on-demand talk radio covering gun, rifle, and bow hunting, whitetail and mule deer hunting, and deer hunting in general. This is a hunting resource for those living the deer hunting lifestyle. Jay Scott is one of the leaders in podcasting in the outdoor industry. It's a pleasure to have Jay on the show today.
Welcome to another episode of Whitetail Rendezvous. This is your host, Bruce Hutchin, and we're heading out to New England today, and we're going to meet one of the guys that has helped me immeasurably figure out what I'm doing with Whitetail Rendezvous, and that is Mr. Jay Scott, who is the founder, creator of Big Buck Registry. Jay, welcome to the show.
Hey, thanks, Bruce. What's going on, man?
Hey, you know, life is good. As we talked about in the warm-up, I got a new hip. I'm 13 days in a new hip, and I have no hip pain, which I had suffered through, 7 months. So Bruce is a happy boy.
That's excellent. Very, very nice. It's all my friends are getting hip replacements too. So we're all, as we talked about in the pre-show, we're no longer playing baseball. We play a lot of wiffle ball.
That's for sure. And listeners, you might well say, yeah, Bruce, we know you get the hip, but what does that have to do with hunting? Well, last fall I suffered. I suffered getting from my truck to my tree stand. I suffered climbing up the ladder. Mm-hmm. It was hard. But I did it, and I passed on 30 bucks last year because they weren't mature enough. And saw a lot of bucks, but Mr. Wonderful never, came underneath the tree stand. And, it was frustrating because I knew I was limited by our health. So listeners, if you do have things that are going to impede your success next fall, take care of it today.
Yeah, I'm with you. It's always important to think ahead. I mean, hunting itself is kind of like a big plan. It never ends, but you always have to think ahead in hunting, which is an amazing tool to have in life, really. And I think, if you want to bag the big deer, planning ahead is really a key to success. You always have your buddy that ends up, hey, I went out hunting for the first time, sat down for 5 minutes and shot a 12-point buck. That happens. I have friends that have done that, and it drives me insane because I know how many hours I put in the woods. And I think as time goes by, that beginner's luck definitely fades, and now you're stuck with reality. And that the better planning you have for your hunts, the better off you're going to be, and the more likely you're going to have something hanging on your wall.
Let's just camp out, right there and put our feet up and have some tea or coffee or whatever. And let's talk about planning. Let's talk about planning in through Jay Scott's eyes.
Sure. Yeah. Well, I'd say that, deer hunting, I've learned a ton talking to my interviewees, by the way, the guests on our show. And deer hunting for me is it's definitely an all year round venture now. I mean, this time of year, especially in February, March, the scouting never stops, and that's the beauty of deer hunting, is that you may actually be hunting in the fall. The actual recurrence of your education in the woods should never end. Your deer season really should begin the minute that the deer season ends the previous year. And this time of year, I love getting out in the woods. I love doing some shed hunting. I don't find a lot. We don't have a lot of deer in New Hampshire. And when you do have a buck that's worthy, that that's hanging around, that it could be a shooter, the game's on to try to find those sheds. And when you're only talking about 1 or 2 bucks in the area, probably within a few miles, it's not that easy to find their sheds. But what I found is when you get out in the woods and you spend time on these iced down trails, and by iced down I mean these are the trails that the deer have been hitting over and over and over, and as the snow melts around them, they become basically these little ice highways, and you can see where they're more likely to go than others, and you learn a lot. Even in a very, very small 1 acre piece, you'll figure out that those deer like to hang out over there more around those fallen logs. Yet my tree stand, I moved to the other side of the hill, and I bet most likely where the tracks are not, which is my tree stand, that had I just moved it another 300 yards to the west, I'd be better off, because that's where all the deer are hanging out. And I didn't know that until they left all this data on the ground. So the planning starts there. It starts the minute that deer season ends is when the next season begins. And it's not pack it up, get inside, forget about it. It's still, putting on your winter boots, hiking through the snow when it's low enough, and hopefully you find a shed or two, but it's really studying the deer tracks in the snow as the deer would move. And it's a time to get out and actually add more knowledge to your overall hunt. You'll find places that you never knew existed where these deer love to go, or maybe a pattern's changed and you just didn't realize it. It's a good indicator.
Now, how do you journal that information? How do you keep that data so, next fall you go, wait a minute, last winter this was happening, but I don't see that. Oh, if you reread something, you go, oh, I know why, because something happened.
Yep. It depends on the area. If, for example, it's an area that I am extremely familiar with, like I know every square inch of it, I'm making mental notes. If it's an area that I know, generally speaking, it'll go on a mapping app of some sort on my phone. And there are various, mapping apps that we use for hunting and things like that. And there's some that I like more than others. But I'll mark it, and you can put in detailed descriptions of what you found there or why that particular area was important. And then you can go back to your house and blow up the map a little bit, and you'll see where the concentrations of the dots are for different types of indicators, whether it's a lot of droppings, a brand new trail that you didn't know existed, how they skirt the side of a swamp and run in between this one hill, just to the lower side of the swamp area where you were hunting on the other side of the hill. If you hunted the other side of the hill, the chances of you seeing the deer are pretty slim, because you need to be able to have a visual of the edge of the swamp that they're running. And so sometimes it's mental. A lot of times, if it's a larger piece of property that I'm not as familiar with, it goes on a mapping program.
Now, do you put pins in Google Earth? I love my pins in Google Earth. Now, do you do that?
That's basically a Google Earth type structure, yeah.
Okay. And folks, if you're not doing that, if you're not hunting 365 days a year and not storing so you recall the data, then you're really doing yourself a disservice and making hunting harder than it should be.
Yeah. The more data points you can throw on a map with descriptions and details, the more patterns you're going to recognize, which will allow you to set up better in the fall when it's time. And whether you're still hunting, it doesn't really matter. In New England, where we have snow, sometimes early, we're often blessed by this white stuff that falls early in the deer season, and we can, or even sometimes mid deer season, but early in the winter, so to speak. And we'll get up and we'll do tracking. Tracking is one of my favorite ways to hunt. It's probably the number one favorite way for me to hunt is by catching a big track and following it as far as we can. And I've known and studied and learned from some of the masters of the deer woods. The late Lane Benoit taught me several things for it. And I've been reading his books and studying his stuff, and I actually became part of his staff when he was starting to launch American Tracker. Lane died a little over a year ago, so the whole thing collapsed. But the time that I spent with him one-on-one, even though we weren't technically hunting, was just learning about deer and tracks and how to track the big woods, which a lot of his books are written about, and his family is a big tracking family. So if there's nothing that I'd rather do than track. But sometimes, especially like this year, we don't have much snow. We didn't have any snow during the season. So if you can rely more on your mapping data at that point, that'll give you a more of an indicator of where you should set up, either in a tree stand or a still hunt, or even just a stand of some sort, even on the ground.
Jay, what I found in my time with podcasting, people always don't listen to the end. So I moved up how to get in touch with you, or any promos that you want to throw in. Why don't you just take a minute or two, tell people how to get to you on social networks, or your website. Just take a minute or two, and let's let the listeners know how to get in touch with you.
Sure. Email is probably a very good way to get a hold of me, jay@bigbuckregistry.com. Our Facebook page is bigbuckregistry.com/Facebook. You can go there, and that's where it's almost like our flagship place where you can submit a buck, or you can see some of the latest articles being written, and we'll post them there. But we have quite a few followers, and that's a good place to mingle. We're on Twitter, twitter.com/bigbuckregistry, Google, on YouTube, same thing. youtube.com/bigbuckregistry. Those are the main places where we're hanging out. We do have an Instagram account. Bigbuckregistry.com is our website.
Hey, thanks for that. And just, do you have one or two sponsors that you just want to give a shout out?
Yeah, we actually picked up a couple of sponsors just recently. Morse's Sporting Goods and the Euro Hanger. Morse's Sporting Goods is over in Hillsborough, New Hampshire, run by Jim Morse, and I know the whole gang over there, Tom and they're just great folks. It's one of those really old school, very small hunting and fishing retail stores that they're not big box stores. It's one of those old smaller places. Randy Gagney, who happens to be my neighbor, is the head bow tech over there. But they came on board and they're sponsoring our show. And we want to give them a lot of support, because it's they've given us support over the years as far as just being available and getting contact with different deer hunters. And that's where I first met the Benoits, actually, was through Jim Morse over at Morse's Sporting Goods. And the Euro Hanger is just this really interesting device that's designed for the Euro mounts. So if you have a deer and you're doing a European mount, Jim what's his last name? Jim Snow developed this device that you can hang a Euro hanger, or you can do a European mount on, that you can adjust your European skull. And it takes the hole that becomes the cavity in the back of the skull, and then you can adjust it on your wall accordingly. So it worked out pretty good.
Hey, thanks for that. And let's go back to the Benoit brothers. And listeners, if you haven't read their books, you're missing out on some of the greatest hunting lore, lessons learned, traditions that you could listen to. And I don't care if you're down in Texas or in Florida or in Wisconsin, Minnesota, out in the Dakotas. Those guys are just unbelievable. And Jay's been fortunate to be there one-on-one and to meet the guys, which I never did. But, it's just take the time. And what's the name of a couple of their books that listeners should jump on?
There's the Benoit Way, I believe, is one of them. Benoit Bucks is another one. Basically, all you have to do is go to Amazon, type in Benoit Bucks, and there's this. Lane used to tell me how there was this basically a copyright violation, and I don't remember exactly who it was that copied the book that didn't have permission to do it, but he was very upset with quite a few people that took advantage of him and his family through the books. But basically, if you type in Benoit books or Benoit, all of them are great. But the Benoit Way, I think, is the original with Larry, and teaching you kind of how to look for a good track.
Thanks for that. Let's go back to the beginning of Jay Scott and his hunting tradition. Where'd that come from, and where is it today?
It goes way back to my childhood. My dad, although not a particularly good hunter, I wouldn't say he was one of those guys that got out, every day at deer season. He went out during deer season because he was in the military, he was always around firearms, always enjoyed the firearms, always enjoyed the idea of hunting. So my dad actually always got me out in the woods. We'd go and shoot 22s in the woods. We'd go do some rabbit hunting. We tried to deer hunt. We never actually killed a deer, but it got us out into the big woods of New Hampshire. Because even though he wasn't necessarily a big hunter, he always knew the woods very well. He always knew direction. He knew back roads. And I guess back then it might have seemed like it was this amazing, huge piece of property that we're on, because I was only, a very young kid. But my dad always got us out for miles and still loves to walk miles in the woods. But that's where it all started. And I didn't get a lot of hunting during college, but I hunted quite a bit, especially on Thanksgiving. It was a tradition for me and my brother. My father would hit the woods early morning and be back for Thanksgiving dinner. So that's always been this really fond memory. And during college, I didn't hunt much except for Thanksgiving. And then after college, when I really started to get into it more, where I studied it, where I started to read books, started to talk to other people who had been doing it religiously for 30-something years. A guy by the name of Ray Fetto talked to me about turkey hunting. That kind of got me into turkey hunting. I shot my first turkey. Taught me a lot about the outdoors and the plays to make in certain situations. He took me out to New York and let me call, and I instantly became a good turkey caller. And I related back to playing an instrument, playing the saxophone. It's almost like playing a reed instrument, using a mouth call. That's pretty much all I've ever used, because I can manipulate that in a lot of the ways that I used to manipulate the saxophone to make different sounds that I wanted it to make. Ray also taught me a lot about deer hunting. My friend Gino Antonioni taught me a lot about deer hunting. He didn't know as much, but he was also a student of Ray's in a sense. So we kind of learned together, and eventually we started shooting deer and basically tromping around the upper valley in New Hampshire. And that's kind of stuck. And then year after year, it was more interesting to me. It's still more interesting to me. And I still get out in the woods as often as I can during deer season and even out of deer season, just to be outside. So I think that's where it all started. Started with my dad. My grandfather was a pretty good deer hunter in his day. And he brought me out, and he usually took me trout fishing. He brought me trout fishing more than anything in these little brooks. So he taught me a lot about little trout and catching trout in these great brooks in New Hampshire. And he was a deer hunter, and he always told me stories about deer hunting. And he was the one guy that I knew that had a really impressive buck mount on his wall that I had always loved seeing. He lived next door to me. I could go see him anytime. I'd sit on the porch. He'd tell me hunting stories. He'd talk to me about duck hunting. He'd always have, during duck season, he and his son my uncle would always come back with ducks, and I always get to hear the story. And he'd tell me these stories about how he actually killed deer with a knife before, where he had, two deer had come running up over a hill, and he actually was able to jump on one, get out his knife and stab it and killed it. So to me, and I don't know if that was really true, because he used to elaborate and tell some pretty good stories, but to this day, I still think it was true, but it always stuck in my head that, and even more impressively now, if that was true, to kill a deer with a knife might be one of the biggest accomplishments as a hunter that you can imagine, getting right down to your true roots as a predator.
I would agree. Wow.
Yeah. So and I can't envision that really happening, because I didn't know him at that phase in his life, but he was a World War II veteran, and certainly, physically capable, but, he told the story and I always sat back and just took it all in. So I think that's where all this hunting desires, and it's a magical moment when you start talking to your dad or your grandfather about their deer hunting endeavors.
Let's talk about a couple of lessons learned that you took from just last year, and maybe it wasn't such a good lesson, and you went, oops, I got Mr. Wonderful took care of me on that. I got schooled on that. Or it might be something, boy, did I finally figure it out, and, I finally got it right. Mm-hmm. Share a couple of those with us.
Yeah, well, I think one of them was I had my son with me in a little blind. I'd found this place where I thought the deer were moving through. It was just off of a really good bedding area. And I had located it early season, just before the season started, and I figured I'd try to hunt it for the regular bow. And I never saw a lot of tracks out there, but it just seemed right because I'd always seen deer in certain areas, but I could never quite pinpoint where they had traveled out in and out of. And I finally thought I'd figured it out. And the setup it's basically off of a main old train track where the tracks have been pulled up. And it's about 3 miles from my house. And I can take my four-wheeler to a junction, and then I get off the four-wheeler, and I can walk another mile into the woods. And it's off of a walking path, and I can cut in and head west off of this trail and get in next to what is a fairly thick covered old clear cut that has now grown over, and now it's a bedding area for whitetail. And I'll go in there, and there's this giant rock formation. So if you climb up to the top of the rock formation, there's a split in it. And if you get in the split, it gives you a great hiding spot to look down over it, and gives you about a 150-yard shot in basically 270 degrees. And it puts you on a plateau without actually getting into a ladder stand. So I thought this might be an interesting place to set up. And sure enough, first night, deer came in. The problem was it was just after dark. They stayed a little distance from me. They actually winded me because the cone was blowing in their direction. And then I decided to kind of back off of there. And I went back another time, had my son with me. And finally, here are some deer coming in during daylight hours, shooting hours. There were 3 does. And I was with the archery equipment. I was ready to take a doe. And they were coming in, and I drew back, and the front of my bow hit the rock, and I couldn't get my full draw on. I had to take a step back up onto, which put me on a slightly higher plane. The problem was that the movement caught the deer's eye, and it wasn't the deer that I was going to shoot at. And as I'm waiting for the doe to come into range, and she was just seconds away, I should say, the other 2 deer that were traveling with her picked up on my movement because I couldn't stretch out. If I had just had a smaller bow or had it been in a tree stand or set up slightly differently in that one spot, and I'm talking the difference between standing in a 1 foot area difference. If I had taken and set up 1 foot behind me, I would have had a good kill shot on this one deer. But instead, I drew back. I hit the bottom of the bow, hit the rock. I couldn't pull back, and the 2 deer to the left picked up on my movement, alerted the 3 of them, and they were gone. So I guess what that tells you is that this deer hunting is a game of inches, and that you had better prepare or at least do the draws as you're sitting in your areas, no matter what it is, just to make sure that you have everything that's there. So the one thing I didn't do was to draw from that one spot in that area where I thought they would be, or it's not where I didn't expect them to show up. I expected them to show up in a different area for the shot. What I had to work with could have been a good shot, but my bow hit the rock, so game over. So I guess the point is just know your setups. Know it like you would be shooting that today. Test your shots before you actually get to those wee hours of the evening when magic happens.
And listeners, I hope you're taking notes on that. And I just call it myself. I call it firing solutions. Every single stand I have, I know the firing solutions. I know where there's no way that I'm going to get a shot. Doesn't matter if it's Mr. Wonderful and his brothers and his cousins. I can't shoot there.
Right.
But if you know that, then as Jay said, he was just inches away from full draw and closing the deal and harvesting the deer. And you got to know that. So practice that. Thanks so much for bringing that out, Jay, because so many times we go, oops, I didn't think of that. And it comes together so fast, as you can attest to. When it's that time, it's seconds that we got to close the deal.
Right. Yep. You can work an awful long time. You can work all season long, and it comes down to about 3 seconds. And if you aren't exactly in the right spot with the right everything during those 3 seconds, then all that hard work is not going to pay off.
So why do we do that? Why do we spend hundreds of dollars, travel? Some people travel, some people just walk out their back door. But why do we do that? For that 1 3-second rush and, finishing the project or putting the period on it, however you want to say it. Why do you think us hunters do that?
I think it's just the human nature, honestly. I don't think it has anything to do with hunting. I think it has to do with trying to build something, whether it's a hunt, whether it's some new steps for your backyard or whatever it is, putting in the time to see and then stepping back and looking at the results of this thing unfolding has this pleasuring effect to say that, hey, I did that. And when it relates to hunting, why do we put so much time into it? I guess it depends on your, what you love. And, I love being outside. I love hunting. I think all hunters have this love of there's this magical moment, this magical feeling when you're just sitting in the woods, learning about nature, understanding nature, sitting in its very element. In fact, studies have been done, scientific studies, where breathing in the air in the forest actually drops blood pressure and increases all the good things in your brain than sitting inside and not being in that element. So I think it's biological. I think it actually is more biological than we think, but actually just being outside and then finding some way to make all that happen for those 3 seconds, it gives you this sense of accomplishment. And the accomplishment comes in all kinds of forms. In life, it could be all kinds of things. But I think when you're hunting whitetail and you're looking for that one deer for those very 3 seconds, and you'll do it year in, year out, and you may hunt the same deer for 3 years, 4 years. You may never get that deer, but you'll still do it and still rival and feel great about all those few seconds that you spend with actually the success shot that you've been aiming for who knows. So I think it's an emotional, it's a psychological, it can set your tone. It's humbling. But I think it's also got a biological nature in the sense when the actual air of the forest is better for you than the air of your house.
Wow, I'm sitting here taking notes, and unfortunately, Jay, we're at the end of the show, end of this segment, and I look forward to having you back on Whitetail Rendezvous. So on behalf of Whitetail Rendezvous Podcast and all our listeners throughout North America, Jay Scott, Big Buck Registry, thank you so much for being a guest today on our show.
My pleasure, Bruce. Thanks for having me on.
As your host at Whitetail Rendezvous, I want to thank each and every one of you for spending your time with us today. I look forward to sharing with you in the next episode more whitetail hunting tips, techniques, and stories. Until then, keep the sun at your back, the wind in your face, and always be patient.
If you have any tips, comments, or suggestions, or what we can do to improve, because we're here to serve you, let us know. Thanks for listening to Whitetail Rendezvous Podcast at www.whitetailrendezvous.com.